What's up everybody? Today we're going to be installing this fuel pressure regulator on the 300Z. So the last video I did, I installed these fuel rails that you can see here. If you haven't seen that video, I'll post a link. But I mentioned that because the first thing I'm going to have to do is actually take them off. What I didn't think about at the time is these fittings on the end here. I need to install them. And the fittings that I'm going to be using, when you try to turn them, they'll just smack against this. So in order to get those on, I'm going to have to take those off. Now what I have to do is use this fitting here in the front, and then in the rear here I'll use this little elbow. And what these are is they're actually NPT to AN fitting. The fuel rail itself has NPT threads on it. So you have to have something that goes from NPT to AN, which is what I'm using for all the rest of my fittings. And that's what the fuel pressure regulator uses as well. It came with a few fittings, but I'm going to need a lot more. So I got mine off of Summit. You can go on there and search through them and find pretty much anything you need. The fuel pressure regulator itself I got off of Amazon. It was some cheap one. It was like 40 or 50 bucks. It feels pretty solid. I think it'll work. So on the NPT threads, you have to use some kind of thread sealant. I've heard it's not very good to use like Teflon tape in your fuel system, which makes sense because it could get in there and clog things up. So I'm using this. It's just a Permatex thread sealant, and you don't use it on the AN fittings, like I said, just on the NPT fittings. Get that in there pretty snug. Alright, I got those fuel rails back in with the proper fittings on the end. Down on this end, they're angled a little bit different. I'm not 100% sure, but right now my thinking is on this side I'm going to run the return fuel line just straight back. On this side I'm going to go out the side over here and then come up. My goal is to put the fuel pressure regulator somewhere right over there. It's right here next to the battery, as you can see. I got myself a little piece of scrap, and there was already a little hole right down here. And anyways, I just drilled a hole in this. I'm going to bolt that right there, and then I should just be able to install the fuel pressure regulator right here. Alright, so there it is, folks. The fuel pressure regulator is installed. It's definitely not the most pretty job. Got a nice wood bracket there, but that's just what I had here, and I wanted to get this done, so I used what I had. The next part of the job is going to be to plumb the fuel system. So let's go ahead and break that down really quick. So this is how we are going to plumb the fuel pressure regulator. The fuel line comes in, it goes to the fuel filter. I'm leaving the stock fuel filter. Then it goes, we're going to have a Y block that splits the fuel line. It's going to go to the two fuel rails, exit. It's going to stay in two different lines, and then with each line it's going to enter the fuel pressure regulator, one on each side. Then the bottom of the fuel pressure regulator is going to be our return, which will return to the fuel tank. So that's a quick breakdown of how this is going to be plumbed. So to get this started, I have this NPT fitting that I'm going to have to use one of these adapters to adapt it to an AN fitting. And this will go into the stock fuel line. As I mentioned, I'm using the stock fuel filter. This is a 5/16 fitting for the 5/16 line. But once again, because it is an NPT fitting, I'm going to go ahead and put some of this thread compound stuff on here. There's nothing too special about these fittings. You just push them in there as far as you can, and then there's a little clamp that you clamp down, and that's pretty much it. Now I need a piece of hose that will go from that fitting I just put in to this Y block. This hose came with the fuel pressure regulator kit. It also came with a few of these fittings. I'm going to be using this for this section. So you do want to make sure you're using the right type of fittings for the nylon braided hose, or if you have stainless steel braided hose. Later on I'm just going to use some rubber hose. Those have different fittings. At the end of this video, after we get everything installed, I'll go into more detail on the different types of fittings. These nylon braided hoses are pretty straightforward. You just stick this section in here far as you can. You can kind of see in there. So you want to get that in, and then this end just goes in and screws together. As you screw it together, it will push itself inside the hose. You just have to make sure that it's not pushing the hose out as you're screwing it in. And there you have it. If you want to reduce some of your scratching and stuff, I think these fittings are kind of cheap anyways because they came with that fuel pressure regulator. But if you have ever seen like those aluminum wrenches that they have for these, those will help prevent getting them scratched up like that. So as you can see, I got the Y block on there now, which will split into two hoses and go to the fuel rail. And then I'll start working on these next because they have some different fittings than those last fittings I showed you. In order to make this video not too repetitive, I'll show you how to do one of the push fittings, and then I'll probably go ahead and get everything plumbed up and kind of show you the finished product. Alright, so these push fittings are pretty straightforward. You basically just push them right into the hose. I've had these in the freezer. Supposedly that makes them easier to push on. I'm just going to use a little bit of WD-40 to lube it up. Alright, so that was pretty straightforward. I've heard people say that these can be a pretty big pain. That wasn't too bad. Maybe putting them in the freezer does help. I know some people will heat up the hose as well to soften that up, but that went on pretty easy. I don't think I'll have any trouble with the rest of them. That's basically the difference in the fittings. So I'm going to go ahead and continue the process of getting this all plumbed up and then show you the finished product. Alright folks, this is the finished product. So you can see the fuel filter there. That's the incoming fuel line. It comes up, over, around the Y block underneath there, splits, goes into the fuel rails, then both fuel rails exit out this side, come around, go into the fuel pressure regulator. Underneath the fuel pressure regulator, there's a hose that goes out, goes down, and that's the fuel return line. Alright, so it's do or die time now. I'm going to put some power to the car, turn the ignition on. That should initiate the fuel pump, and then we're going to see if I have any leaks in the system. So I can hear the fuel pump running. I don't see any leaks, so that's good. Alright, so I got all the fuel lines in, but I wanted to share with you a few things that I learned. This is the first time I've done this, and if it's the first time you're looking into this, there's probably a few tips I can give you that will help you. As you probably saw, I had a lot of different types of fittings and different types of hose, and I was just kind of using what I had to make it work. If I was going to do it again, I would probably really try to have just one type of hose and one type of fitting to simplify everything. If you're planning on using AN fittings, there's different sizes of AN fittings. These are all -6. However, you have to make sure you have the right hose for the right type of fitting. So you can have -6 fittings that are for nylon braided hose, you can have dash 6 fittings that are for steel braided hose, and you can have dash 6 fittings that are those push type fittings. Before I started this, I was kind of worried about the push fittings. I heard that those are really hard to get together. Mine went on pretty easy. I didn't have much trouble. I don't know what the big deal is. However, if I was going to do it again, I would probably go with the nylon braided hose, as that's what a lot of the fittings that came with the fuel pressure regulator were. It would just be easier to buy one type and have one consistent, fitting that you can use throughout your whole process. The other thing I struggled with is I did have a plan, but the plan didn't work exactly how I wanted as far as routing it and which pieces were going to go where. So then I kind of had to start changing things up and mixing and matching. Ultimately, I was able to get it all installed. Luckily, I didn't have to order any more parts. But that's one thing I would really try to plan out in detail before you even get started, is the routing that you're going to use for your hose and exactly which fitting you're going to need on each end. Now those fittings are expensive. Some of them, are $5, $10, even $20 a piece. So I didn't want to spend a bunch of extra money and have a bunch of extra fittings laying around. So I made it work with what I had. But I would definitely suggest doing your research and making a plan before you get started. Hopefully this video was helpful. As always, remember to like and share the video, and thanks for watching.